So from this moment, this event is being recorded. I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Besnik Sinani, and I'm a research fellow here at the Center for Muslim Theology at Tübingen University. I conduct research at the Chair for Hadith and Prophetic Studies. Today, we are conducting the first event of what will be a series of seminars focusing on the study of prophetology in the Muslim tradition. We are extremely grateful of the scholars who have agreed to be part of this project. And behind this seminar is a larger vision of what we're trying to do here, of creating a platform and a database of resources and scholarship focusing on the study of the Muslim tradition of prophecy and how it speaks and enters into a conversation with other religious traditions, other theological traditions. And we are immensely grateful that we have scholars who speak on from very different disciplines. We have today a historians, and there will be a number of historians who will present here. We have people who study religious studies. We have people who study the theological aspect of prophecy, and others who speak more to the pietistic Muslim tradition. And so there is an impressive kind of coming together of scholars speaking to this topic, and we're extremely grateful. So in the months to come, we intend to hoping to get the grant funding. We're hoping to expand on this project, and so please follow us and keep an eye on what we're doing in the coming months and in the coming years, as we intend to have more events like this and publications and conferences that we want to make available to other scholars and researchers. So that's in kind of if you look at our Twitter account, you can have a look at the list of scholars. All these events will be taking place on Tuesdays at the same time. Next week, we are honored to have Frank Griffel from Yale University joining us, speaking about the Ash'ari tradition in conversation with the philosophical school of Ibn Sina, so it is quite a collection of presentations coming up. Having said that, I want us to kind of focus now on our event today. So we are extremely grateful that we're joined here by Aron Rocksinger. And I have to say that you must have the most exciting last name in academia. I couldn't keep that to myself. You must have heard that from other people, of course. And we are delighted that Aron will be talking today and will be presenting on his most recent book, in the shade of the Sunna. But before that, what is really impressive is this is actually in a 3-year period. This is Aron's second book. So his first book, published by Cambridge University Press, is Practicing Islam in Egypt, Print Media and Islamic Revival, published in 2019. And in 2022, published by University of California Press, comes his second book, In the Shade of the Sunna, Salafi Piety in the 20th Century Middle East. I don't know how many people today are producing scholarship with that kind of speed and energy. So I'm really impressed with that. Aron holds a PhD from Princeton University. Before that, he earned an MA from St. Anthony's, if I'm not mistaken, at Oxford, and a bachelor's from University of Pennsylvania. He is primarily a historian. He is a social and intellectual historian of the modern Middle East with a research focus on 20th century Islamic movements and states. This study that he will be presenting today explores Islam's fastest growing movement known as Salafism through a transnational lens with particular emphasis on Egypt, and moving beyond a focus on specific organizations or commitment to the boundaries of a particular nation state. It traces the emergence and consolidation of a distinctively Salafi social practices, and it covers like a century time period from 1926 to the present. And it, as now, from the very title, you can see that this kind of speaks directly to what we're doing here in studying particularly forms of prophetic piety, or forms of piety that are grounded on the idea of ittiba, or imitatio of Muhammad. And the way that concept, which is central to Islamic piety, is kind of manifested in modern times, is the subject of Aron's book. So without taking more time, and I've already spoken a lot, I am really delighted and extremely grateful that Aron agreed to do this with us. And so I'm gonna stop talking here and ask Aron to present his book. So thank you for coming, and the floor is yours.
All right, Besnik, thanks so much for having me. Very much an honor to be part of this series, and an exciting opportunity to kick it off today. I also want to thank everyone from both within and beyond Tübingen for logging on. I'm grateful to be hosted by the Senior Research Seminar in Prophetology, which is part of the Chair for Hadith and Prophetic Studies at the Center for Muslim Theology. Now, today's topic, my recent book, In the Shade of the Sunna, Salafi Piety in the 20th Century Middle East, and the theme of this seminar, namely Prophetology, fit pretty well. And so when Besnik asked me to participate, I was thrilled, because it was an opportunity to talk about a topic that, needless to say, I find pretty interesting, namely how Salafis, a modern Islamic movement deeply committed to emulating the prophetic model through direct engagement with the Quran and Sunna, did so in the 20th century. Now, the title of the book, as many of you may have picked up, is an allusion. In the Shade of the Sunna is an allusion to Sayyid Qutb's tafsir, In the Shade of the Quran. And there's something particularly notable about this tafsir, namely how Qutb understands his interpretive position vis-a-vis the text, namely that he describes immersing himself in the Quran in such a way that all of his ideas came directly from it. And this is also how Salafis understand themselves to be engaged in the Sunnah, though they, of course, also take the Quran as an essential source. And it's really important to recognize this as a self-understanding that is linked directly to this imperative, this telos of resembling the Prophet Muhammad. But it's equally important to question the extent to which it's actually historically accurate. Because the extent that we take Salafi's word, or rather we take this internal category as an analytical category, we risk really missing some of the connections between Salafism and other movements, Islamic and non-Islamic, whether in Egypt, in the Middle East, or beyond the Middle East. Now, I want to begin with how I think about understanding Salafism as a social movement. This is the book about the genesis of 4 distinctly Salafi social practices over the course of the 20th century: a fist-length beard, the qabda as a minimum, praying in shoes, gender segregation, and finally, observance of isbal, the prohibition against letting one's robes hang down. And in the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to be discussing how I approach this question and why I did so. Now, behind this question of social practice is usually assumed to be the idea of a distinctly Salafi manhaj. And a distinctly Salafi manhaj is indeed important to understanding this movement's social project. But the manhaj is the end point of the process of intellectual development rather than the beginning. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that what we see beginning in the 1930s is the emergence of a Salafi claim to God's oneness, to Tawheed, and related to that claim to Tawheed, an understanding of worship, ibadah, that while drawn from aspects of the pre-modern Islamic tradition, particularly the work of Ibn Taymiyyah, is also deeply indebted to 20th century secular nationalism. And I want to note two aspects in which it's indebted. The first is that the claim to be upholding Tawheed in the Egyptian context, which is the focus of this book, or is the center of this book geographically, even though the book is transnational, the argument to be upholding Tawheed in a country that is 90% Muslim bears some discussion, because it's not simply a theological statement, but also a religio-political one. And we might here think about the claim to be upholding Tawheed, not merely as a theological claim, but also as an articulation of an alternative form of sovereignty. That the claim to be upholding Tawheed in the face of an Egyptian government, which is not perceived to apply Islamic law, in the face of other Islamic movements, which themselves claim to uphold their own understandings of God's oneness and what follows from that oneness. And here I think it's useful to think in terms of the distinction that Cole Bunzel makes in his work between understanding Tawheed as monotheism and understanding it as monolatry, as the orientation of human action towards worship of God. That it's in this context that we need to situate Salafi claims to Tawheed in this very particular ideological environment of competing claims to sovereignty. The second point I'd make about Salafi understandings of Tawheed is that what we have during this period, from roughly 1930 to 1970, before the emergence of the term manhaj as really a dominant term within the Salafi movement, is a transformation of a long-standing boundary of Islamic law. Right? In Islamic law, traditionally, we have this distinction between ibadat, acts of worship, and mu'amalat, acts of mutual transactions and interactions. And then there's, thirdly, a category of custom, ada or urf, which in the pre-modern Islamic fiqh tradition essentially stands by the side, that it refers to a variety of domains of human action that the Islamic legal tradition might not touch on specifically. And one might take, for example, here, the vast range of clothing that Muslims have worn across time and space. That there's not an effort in the pre-modern tradition to define one form of clothing as distinctly prophetic, distinctly Muslim. And one of the things we see is the transformation of the category of ada, or custom, from this pre-modern concept into a distinctly modern concept in which ada, in which customs are the basis for the strength of communities, whether those are national communities or religious communities. And what's striking about this is that this is not the concept of custom that we have in the fiqh tradition. Rather, it is the concept of custom derived from secular nationalism. And in my book, I show, looking at not just Egyptian Salafi periodicals, but in this case, at the long-standing Syrian Salafi periodical Tamaddun al-Islami, how the concept of custom derived from secular nationalism comes into this discussion over what it means to engage in upholding Tawheed, and particularly the way in which the boundary between what is considered questions of ritual of worship and what is considered questions of custom that are essentially up to local variation is adjusted. And this is in some sense the way in which Salafis in Egypt and beyond seek to increasingly regulate daily life. And this shouldn't be a surprise, right? Because if the movements they're competing with are seeking to regulate daily life, then it's no surprise that they seek to do so as well. They just do so in a distinct manner. Now, second, I want to get to the question of why I wrote a book about Salafi piety. I was always struck reading the academic literature on Salafism while I was in grad school that we had these definitional challenges over what a Salafi was. And then in 2016, Henri Lazier's fantastic book came out, and that gave us a conceptual definition of what Salafism was, of referring to both Neo-Hanbali theology, a particular approach to God's names and attributes, and also to deriving all law from the Quran and the Sunna. But still, we have a challenge, right? How do we get past this normative citation that Salafis engage in of the Quran and Sunnah to understand how they develop as a social movement? Now, related to that is a challenge of the broader academic literature in Salafism, which tends to privilege both politics and political violence. So the Islamist or political Salafis and the Salafi jihadis. But this isn't what most Salafis are. And these two subsets of Salafism are minorities in the face of a larger quietist majority. And so I was very interested in really digging into how the quietist project of Salafism works, though of course all of these social practices are also shared by other members, other subsets of this movement. Now a third issue I was interested in really pushing further in was that there's a broad sense in the academic literature, with a few exceptions, that Salafis are kind of religious automatons. Samuli Shilka, the anthropologist, uses the term Homo Islamicus to describe how Salafis are often depicted. And what I really wanted to show was that not just that Salafis are not religious automatons, but that they not only shape the societies in which they live, but they are shaped by them. And they're really fundamentally shaped by the societies in which they've grown up, that they are fundamentally rooted in particular times and places. And I found practice to be a particularly productive angle from which to tackle this question. And to bring us to the topic of today, practices help us understand how Salafis seek to emulate the Prophet Muhammad, because they aren't understood at first glance to constitute a hot button issue. So there's in some sense more debate over how practices develop than there might be over how theology develops. And this brings me to my third point, the question of how to make sense of this 20th century project of Salafism. And one way to begin thinking about that is to ask what it means to cite the model of the 7th century. How might we understand citation not merely as an act predicated on producing historical continuity, here continuity with the Prophet Muhammad, but one that equally requires a rupture or discontinuity, that citation is also a historically destructive act, that we cite the past in order, particularly the distant past, in order to bring us back to that distant past, but then we're skipping a lot of history in the middle. Now, it is certainly the case that we can acknowledge the long-standing telos of modeling oneself or imitating the Prophet Muhammad through practice. And this is found across time and space in Islamic history. And it's certainly the case that historically following the Sunna has been the basis for pursuing this endeavor. Yet in thinking about how Salafism develops as a movement, we also have to think about the 20th century. Namely, what are the ruptures of modernity that shape how one cites the past generally, and specifically how one cites a defined slice of Islamic history, here the 7th century. And the second question then is, where do we look for this project of citation, which we might also approach as a project of radical intellectual and social reconstruction? And here I'm using the term radical in the sense that Muhammad Qasim Zaman uses it in his recent book on Islamic reform, that the radicalism isn't in the particular approach to politics or political violence, but rather it is in the radical ruptures of modernity in which these ideas and practices develop. Now, when we think about how to understand this project of radical intellectual and social reconstruction, this is first and foremost a question of conceptually where to look, how to move beyond a normative focus on the Quran and Sunnah. And in some sense, I think that one of the challenges of the study of Salafism is that one engages in so much work to master the relevant fields in the Islamic sciences, namely Neo-Hanbali theology and Islamic law, that it is very easy to then go from that to say, oh, well, this is what Salafis claim to be doing. Let's look at these sources and explain what they're doing. And I would hardly, I'm certainly not claiming that understanding theology and law aren't important to understanding Salafism. But rather what I'm claiming is if we want to understand Salafi approaches to theology and law, we actually need to understand practice, because it is exactly in practice, in regulating practice, that these questions of theology and law are worked out. that they feature very prominently. Now, there's also a question here of which sources we should look at. Now, the traditional Islamic studies approach to this would be to look at these multi-volume compendium, particularly legal compendia. Now, I grew up reading a lot of magazines, particularly Sports Illustrated, and I got really interested in how magazines worked. And so I've ended up being a historian of periodicals, broadly speaking. But those are my main sources, also pamphlets. And part of what's so fun about periodicals in the case of tracing religious continuity and change is that they provide us not merely with the end point of a certain position, which one could find from a pamphlet or a multi-volume legal work, they provide us with the granular process. And we can see the ideological influences of other groups on Salafis and vice versa in that context. There's also a question in tackling this question of who we see Salafism's comparable cases to be. Because often they're studied on their own, and I think we miss a lot in studying them on their own. Now, the first group that we might look at are other Muslims of vastly varying views, such as secular nationalists or Islamists. How are they shaped by Salafis? How do Salafis shape them? But we also might think globally about non-Muslims who resemble Salafis in their preoccupation with particularly precise ritual practice. And here I'm thinking about Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox or Haredi Jews in the United States in particular. And I'm happy to come back to that point later in this conversation. And finally, we might ask, what do we pay attention to when we examine projects of citation of the past, specifically the citation of the Prophet Muhammad's model? Now, an obvious angle here is to focus on which prophetic practices are revived, and how we can establish continuities between what the historical record that Muhammad did in 7th century Medina is, and which practices are revived. And for example, we have the practice of praying in shoes, which we have very clear textual evidence that Muhammad did this in 7th century Medina to distinguish Muslims from Jews. And we see this being revived in mid-20th century Egypt. In my book, however, I pushed for an emphasis on another angle, namely the logic by which particular practices are performed. So we might have Muslims in the 7th century and Muslims in the 21st century or 20th century, both praying in shoes, but their respective guiding logics may be very, very different. And here I argue that we really need to focus on when and why particular practices are adopted. And here I want to note an article from March 1952 in Ansar Sunna's magazine of Hadi al-Nabawi. And this article declares, Ansar Sunna pray in shoes without shame because they pray based on belief in God and his prophet and in obedience to God and his prophet. This is not an affected behavior or a custom or blind imitation without guidance or vision. It is actually praiseworthy. So the claim here is that praying in shoes is mustahab. Now, Abdul Nasser comes to power in 52, along with Muhammad Naguib. He takes full power in 54. Shortly thereafter, he launches a pretty serious crackdown on the Brotherhood, which leads to a variety of Islamic movements essentially moving away from these very conspicuous public practices. And then the striking thing is that for basically 40 years, until roughly 1989, and I have spent not just hours, many days, months, months, with Ansar Sunna's magazines from the 30s through the 90s. And this drops off until 1989. They don't talk about praying in shoes. And then when they do talk about praying in shoes again in 1989, it is to make a claim for why, while this is a prophetic practice, there are a variety of good reasons why one might have to abstain from it. So the project of praying in shoes is this paradoxical one where Salafis initially valorize a practice where there's real precedent for 7th century Medina, for the Prophet in 7th century Medina engaging in this practice, and then they drop it. And then they provide a series of reasons to drop it that are essentially extra textual, that are about essentially not disturbing the peace, not being rude, not producing fitna, and so forth. I'd also say it's important in focusing on practice to pay attention to how textual evidence is used in the service of decidedly novel ends. And here, in the case of gender segregation, we have a particularly striking case because in the late 1970s, the leading Saudi Salafi, Abdulaziz ibn Baz, who is working within this broader Wahhabi Hanbali establishment in Saudi Arabia, he has a problem because gender segregation is the position of the Wahhabi Hanbali elite. It's something that Muhammad bin Ibrahim, who dies in 69, has taken a very strong position on, and bin Ibrahim being really the doyen of the Wahhabi Hanbali religious establishment. Ibn Baz is his successor. And Ibn Baz, though, has a problem because Ibn Ibrahim's justifications for gender segregation largely relate to the need to damn the pretexts of sin. That it's because gender mixing leads to forbidden actions that therefore gender mixing is forbidden. The problem for Ibn Baz, though, is that as a Salafi, he needs a citation from the Quran and the Sunna. And what he ends up doing in the absence of a clear citation from the Sunna is he ends up claiming that the Quranic prohibition against tabarruj, against women flaunting, actually means gender mixing. That, I remember reading this for the first time and just being amazed. He declares, tabarruj ma'nahu al-ikhtilat. Tabarruj means mixing. Now, this is a position that, as far as I can tell, was literally unprecedented. The Brotherhood had been talking about gender mixing for 50 years. They'd never made this claim. A leading female Salafi scholar in Egypt, Ni'mat Sidki, had come out with a book in the early 70s called At-Tabarruj, which she'd actually published in installations in Ansar Sunnah magazine over the course of the preceding decades. And her argument that Tabarruj was just about female individual contact, about comportment. This was also the position taken by Muhammad Nasr al-Albani, one of the other heavyweights of 20th century Salafism. And so Ibn Baz had to essentially go out on a textual limb. It wasn't a very strong textual limb, and he ended up essentially walking it back implicitly. Now, I'll wrap up with a few points of what I discovered in doing all this and the implications of it. One argument I make in the book, and a central argument of the book, is that in foregrounding daily practices, the project of the Salafi social practices link between ethics and visibility. So this idea that to be a Salafi is not merely to seek to emulate the Prophet in your private life, to believe so in your heart, to engage in a series of practices that are premised on emulating Prophet, but to be seen as emulating the Prophet, that the visibility is central. And this is a linkage between ethics and visibility in which how one looks is not simply an outward manifestation of how one is, but rather it's that how one looks is actually central, not only to how one is, but to being perceived as a member of a given group. And here, this is how we can understand why Salafis, secular nationalists, and Islamists all compete over what a proper beard is. It's not simply that they're competing with each other, but that they are all descendants, conceptually speaking, from modern state-sponsored projects of subject formation, which link between allegiance or ethics and a particular visible identity. And here we can think, for example, about state-sponsored projects within the bureaucracy, within schools, within the military, in which people signal their belonging to these institutions by wearing particular kinds of uniforms. We also see this in the interwar period in Egypt, where various paramilitary groups, such as those tied to Young Egypt and the Wafd, wear green shirts and blue shirts, and this is linked right to the shirts movement in Europe during the same period, to indicate their allegiance to particular factions. The second point here is really how we understand Islamic thought in modernity, really emphasizing the radical nature of the age rather than the radical nature of thought, and thinking about the ways in which if the group that most prizes continuity with the 7th century is so shaped by the transformations of modernity, then surely we can argue that this is a broader dynamic within Islamic movements, within piety projects more broadly. And the third point is a call for greater use of periodicals in telling stories of Islamic law and telling stories of Islamic thought. There are relatively few folks who use this kind of source. It's often seen in some sense as not being as serious as these legal compendia. And I will admit, the legal compendia look much nicer on your bookshelf. I will freely admit that. I love having those on my bookshelf too. I love it even more when the magazines are reprinted to look like this. And so you've just got these great magazines on the shelf, and you get the best of both worlds. But what I'm suggesting here is that insofar as the story of Islamic law in the 20th century and the 21st century is not simply a story, it's not a story primarily of states implementing law, but rather of Islamic movements and scholars seeking to transmit particular legal visions, and then those legal visions being lived in practice, that we need to look more towards Islamic law and society. And here magazines provide a particularly valuable source in tracing not merely the positions that emerge, but how and why they emerge. I'll cut it off there so we can go into having a conversation and questions. I want to reiterate my appreciation to Besnik for having me, for all the folks at Tübingen who have made this possible, and I look forward to questions and conversation.
Thank you very much, Aron. Really thought-provoking, and I certainly have quite a few things that I would like to ask you to elaborate, but at the same time, to the folks who are following us, and we're very grateful that they joined us here today, you can either kind of write your questions in the text or kind of indicate that you have a question, and then you can unmute but if we can do that in an orderly manner. However, I think in the interest of kind of keeping some order, I think it is useful if we can you can use the chat and write your questions there. Aron, if I may kind of use kind of my position here and try to and ask you to kind of go back to your previous work, but I think it's very relevant to the current conversation. If we can go back to the idea of the length of the beard, which become a very visible form of Salafi identification, which is founded on this idea of following the prophet, this piety grounded in the prophetic vision. And I think that I remember when I first read your article, it is one of those moments when you start scratching your head because you have taken a lot of things for granted. And then you make this very compelling argument that this whole debate about the length of the beard is a very, very recent discussion, which I think that it speaks to the other practices that you spoke about. And so if we think of the ways that kind of prophetic piety is implemented in contemporary religiosity, then I think it would be interesting to kind of, if you may, discuss a little bit this question of the length of the beard and the way that it kind of becomes a major marker of Salafi piety. And since I'm here, I find very fascinating your comment on the periodicals. And if we attempt to believe for a moment that the medium is the message, then I think that we're at a first of all, what does the use of periodicals at this time period tell us about the transformations in society and in forms of religiosity? And the second thing is, like, your research extends to today, basically, to the present situation, when we almost see this transformation into the electronic forms of communication, something that I see even in hagiographic literature, that it is interesting that you find increasingly hagiographic material found on websites. And so perhaps if you can kind of venture to think aloud as to what does that tell us about the way that the medium is being changed? And I'm looking forward to other to the people joining us here today, asking their questions.
Well, Besnik, first of all, I want to say I'm disappointed that when you read the beard article, you scratched your head rather than your beard. But more seriously, the story of the beard is fascinating, because if we're thinking about prophetic emulation, we have a command there are a variety of hadith reports about the command to grow the beard and trim the mustache, right? And there's sort of some debate over what one does with the mustache, but the command to grow the beard is unequivocal. But that's not where we get the kabda as a measurement. Where we get the kabda as a measurement is a hadith report in which Ibn Omar is going on Hajj and Umrah, and he trims the beard to the minimum, to the fist in this context. Now, part of what makes this citation interesting is that it's actually not as simple as it looks, right? We can look at it just on the surface and say, well, this doesn't necessarily have to be a standard. This is specific action. This is going on Hajj and Umrah. But also is notable here is, and I want to bring us back here to the 1930s and 40s, is that during the 30s and 40s, we have in Egypt the leading Salafi organization, Ansar Sunna Muhammadiyah, and we have the leading Islamist organization, the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood takes this position that a closely trimmed beard is the correct position. This is very much represented by Hassan al-Banna. And at this time, Ansar Sunna doesn't have a clear position on the beard other than the fact that one should grow one. But it eventually will have this position in the 70s and 80s about the kabda. But here's the thing. Both of these positions, and the Brotherhood position here is articulated by Sayyid Sabik in a series of articles in the Brotherhood's journal, Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimun, which is then integrated, it's then published as Fiqh Sunnah. So this is where this, a few years later, so this is actually where this debate happens originally. Sayyid Sabik's argument for the closely trimmed beard and Salafi arguments for the beard as a minimum of fist both cite the same hadith report. They both cite the Ibn Omar report. One to argue that you can trim period and make it closely trimmed. The other argue that you need a minimum of a fist, which again, I think challenges us to think about whether the claim to literalism and approach is really viable when we actually have two radically different readings of the same source. Now, over the course of the 20th century, and really here we get steam in the 70s and 80s, Salafis come to focus on the fist as a minimum measurement combined with a trimmed mustache. And here, the challenge they face is one of visual distinction, particularly from Islamic student activists and then non-Salafi jihadi groups. The first being in the 70s, the second being in the 80s. And the challenge is, in the first case, the Jama'ah Islamiyya in Egypt, the Islamic student movement, are kind of stealing the Salafis' thunder because they're out there with their bushy beards and with their long jalabiyas, which generally speaking don't show any evidence of observing the prohibition against Isbal. And it's striking, right, because some of these folks who are members of the Jama'ah Islamiyya end up joining Ansar Sunnah, Egypt's leading Salafi organization. And then in the 80s, it becomes very clear that the Salafis keep getting picked up by state security forces because they're being confused with non-Salafi jihadis. And the Egyptian jihadi movement at this point is dominated by non-Salafis. And so they need a way to distinguish themselves. So here we have this challenge, right? And this is a challenge in some respects of the transition from colonial to post-colonial rule of a clear distinction between colonizer and colonized to practice of internal Muslim distinction. And then on top of that, it's a challenge of what does one do when one is getting confused with folk that one does not want to be confused with. And so that really drives the emergence between roughly 1980 and 1995 of the kabda as a minimal measurement combined with the trimmed mustache. Now, what the use of the beard tells us about the transformation of religiosity, I think is twofold. One is that it tells us something about the way in which visibility is increasingly central to piety. And here, I very much part ways with the argument made by Sabah Mahmoud, among others, within the anthropology of Islam literature, who argues that it's essentially Islamists who are focused on this kind of visibility that implicitly that Salafis are not. Her book is, this is, I guess, an under-examined aspect or an under-examined critique of her book, that a bulk of the mosques that she studied were actually affiliated with Salafi organizations, namely Ansar Sunnah and Jama'at Dawat al-Haq. Now, the first point to here is about how important visibility is. I think the second point, and this gets into the conversation, the question about the parallels to Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jewish religiosity that I see in the chat, is that with the spread of literacy, we have a shift from basically piety as defined by acting as those who you perceive to be pious around you act. So saying, okay, a pious Islamic beard is what my father wears or what my older brother wears, to a pious Islamic beard has a specific minimum length. And also this idea that there's this normative power to modern science that we see in the 20th century, in which religious practices are increasingly justified in terms of precision. And that precision, it's not that the Islamic tradition broadly isn't concerned with precision, but we have different models of precision. And this is a distinctly scientific model of precision, of measurement, even though the qabda, a fist, of course, exists very prominently in the pre-modern fiqh literature. And finally, your question about sources. I think it's, in some respects, when we think about YouTube and we think about chat rooms and we think about messenger apps and so forth, there are new structuring dynamics of these mediums. What I've been struck by, however, is the ways in which longstanding dynamics are essentially simply reproduced. That if we think, for example, about Muhammad Nasruddin al-Albani's classic book, Sifat Salat al-Nabi, How to Pray Like the Prophet, and the way in which then one looks that up on YouTube and sees essentially a video of exactly what al-Albani was saying, and just it being acted out, that it's essentially bringing this process forward to a more visual medium, but not changing its core dynamics. I see a lot of questions.
Let me start by reading Professor Kotz's question, which I'm very happy she asked that, because I started thinking as someone who lived in Borough Park for so many years. So she says, I was intrigued by the parallel you drew with pious godly practice among ultra-Orthodox Jewish groups in the US. Could you say more about that?
Yes. So there's this fantastic article in the Jewish Studies journal, Tradition, by a man named Chaim Soloveitchik. He's an academic at Yeshiva University, which is essentially the flagship of modern Orthodox Judaism, located in New York City. And just as interestingly, he is the son of Joseph Soloveitchik, who, along with Moshe Feinstein, is one of the two towering figures of modern 20th century modern Jewish Orthodoxy. And what the younger Soloveitchik writes about is about how religiosity in his community and also in the ultra-Orthodox or Haredi community has been transformed over the course of the 20th century. And the observation here is that the practices of piety, the practices of religious observance performed by members of his community growing up, which is, right, implicitly members of his father's community growing up, which presumably is a pretty serious community, that by the standards of the Orthodox world 50 years later would be considered lax. And what's striking here is not that it's not a reconsideration of these folks as somehow being religiously lax and you just didn't realize it. It's actually, instead, the explanation is that the model of what religious observance looks like has been transformed. And he's particularly focused on a particular legal question, which is specifically for the performance of certain commandments, mitzvot, there's a certain amount of food one needs to use for them, minimal quantity. And he's particularly interested in this question of how the minimal quantity becomes much more exacting, much more precise, as a lens to this broader transformation. And he argues that this is a transformation also within the Haredi or ultra-Orthodox community. And the question is what to make of this, right? And this comes back to this question of Salafism. And what's the global story here? And the argument that the younger Soloveitchik makes is that what we have here is fundamentally a product of a series of intellectual and demographic and institutional changes. And some of those institutional changes are in some sense specific to the Jewish case, namely the rise of the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the, I guess we have a parallel here to the madrasa, as kind of a key religious figure in this context. Some of them are actually completely global, such as the increasing literacy of these communities, the fact that members of these communities are increasingly living in not just non-Orthodox, but non-Jewish daily spaces, and so they need to distinguish themselves. The fact that one has a historical rupture, in the Jewish case, it's the historical rupture of the Holocaust, which creates a whole new set of questions about religiosity and about what learning looks like that might not have existed before. Now, I don't think that these cases are the same. Obviously, the experience of the Holocaust is pretty significantly different here. But I do think that part of what's so striking here is the argument of print and the normativity of science. That these are dynamics we see globally, these are dynamics we see in Egypt, and they very much shape what it means to be pious. And so here we might think of how Salafis criticized their parents' generation, their grandparents' generation, not merely for being religiously lax, but for relying on unreliable Hadith reports and so forth, and link it to these broad-scale changes.
Thank you. And so I have two questions from our colleague here in Tübingen, Claire Galien. So she asks, thank you so much for your presentation. May I ask you to expand on the notion of continuity and discontinuity in citation, which I think it is actually really exciting aspect of your work. And I'm going to read the second question that comes also from Claire, and if that's okay, because I think it speaks also to the critique that you kind of raised when it comes to the work of Saba Mahmoud as to who is actually called a Salafi, and so basically, so I'll put it, I'll read Claire's question here. So she asks, could you talk a bit more about the porosity of Salafis to fellow brothers and sisters who would not define themselves as Salafis? We tend from the outside to depict Salafism as in a box separated from other religious groups, when it appears that most of the time, brothers and sisters live side by side in harmony and friction. There are madrasas in Morocco, for instance, where some students would define themselves as Salafis and some would not, and still attend the same courses. And perhaps kind of to throw a challenge there, we might think of the period when Saba Mahmoud did her research, the late Saba Mahmoud, what we had witnessed what was called the Salafization of the brotherhood, and the emergence of a sahwa in the region, not only as this kind of amalgamation between a worldview inspired by the Muslim Brotherhood, but grounded in the pietistic ideals of Salafism. So, let me stop there, and we have a few more questions coming up after that.
So a lot of great questions here. First of all, as clearly, I really enjoy this question of citation. I have to say, so you're probably getting the sense from my comparison to the Soloveitchik article, that I find actually the Jewish studies literature to be an incredibly generative space for thinking through these questions of text and practice. It's theoretically really rigorous. A lot of it's really fascinating. There's a ton of really fantastic work on piety communities. But here I'm actually thinking of a book from, I guess, about 6 or 7 years ago by a historian at Princeton by the name of Muli Vidas about the Babylonian Talmud, and specifically thinking about practices of citation of the Babylonian Talmud. And Vidas's argument is basically that the traditional way to understand these citation practices of the Talmud is that you have one rabbi citing another who cited one before him and before him and before him, etc. So we basically have a diachronic story of conversation. But what Vidas argues is actually that we need to approach this not as a diachronic story, but as a synchronic story. That yes, there are these conversations, but there were also other conversations. And the particular construction of this conversation is the decision of the final voice in the Talmud of the conversation at a specific time and place. And we need to think about that construction at that time and place, and the dynamics at hand there. And so this isn't to argue that there aren't precedents when one cites the past, but it's that we need to pay really close attention to the extent to which these citations of the past are primarily about this diachronic conversation. And I am certainly not taking the position that that a diachronic conversation doesn't exist. It absolutely does. But that synchronic conversation exists too. And here, I think of an insight by Joel Blecker in his fantastic book about the performance of Hadith and about the Hadith generally, said the Prophet of God, in which he makes this point that Hadith scholars, in some sense, are performing for two audiences. One is the audience of past scholars, and one is the audience of their peers. And they're trying to uphold standards of scholarly excellence set by their predecessors, but they are always situated in the here and now. And so here, when we think about these practices of citation as synchronic, we then, and this brings me to your second question, actually get into this question of how they relate to other Muslims in a given time and place. And we start to understand how folks from very different ideological perspectives are focusing on many of the same things. And we can start to ask this question of why they're focusing on many of the same things. And the crucial point I'd make about the way in which citation is a historically discontinuous act, is to come back to this example of praying in shoes. There's no question that the Prophet Muhammad prayed in shoes. It drops off within a couple hundred years of Islamic history, with the exception of the Hanbali school. And then in the 40s, Salafis revived it. And they do so not merely because of their commitment to emulating the Prophet. There's a variety of ritual practices they could have chosen. They choose it because it makes a statement. Because for those who disagree with their project, it is literally, I'll use a diplomatic phrase, they are drawing a line in the sand. They are establishing their territory. It also allows them to identify each other in the mosque really easily. And this gets to this point of interaction. Because why does praying in shoes carry its particular visible power? I mean, you can think of the other practices as needing to be so clearly visible because Salafis are existing in a non-Salafi world. Well, that extends to mosques. Many Salafis are praying in non-Salafi mosques. And this helps distinguish, it helps them tell who else in the mosque is part of their project. Now, I'm just looking at your second question here. There is this blurring between Salafis and non-Salafis. And certainly in terms of, I think we should also acknowledge that folks who identify as Salafi at one point in their life often leave the movement at other points in their life. Because, and here I'm going to come back to Samuli Shilka. When he did this wonderful ethnography of Salafism in Upper Egypt, he made this point about how hard Salafism is, that because it's so black and white, he makes the comment that in Salafism, you never know when you succeed. There's no marker of success, but you always know when you fail. And that can be exhilarating, but that can also be very, very difficult. And so we have these communities. And I think we can think of Azhar University as an example of such a community where some students are going to be Salafi, some are going to be Islamist, some are going to be neither Salafi nor Islamist, and essentially pretty standard Ash'ari types who attend Azhar because, say their fathers had attended Azhar and they are interested in following that scholarly path. And there absolutely is spillover. And Besnik noted this Salafization of the Ikhwan, the Salaf al-Ikhwan, which was coined by the late Egyptian scholar Hussein Tamam. And this is absolutely a dynamic. One sees the Brotherhood donning the niqab to a greater, Brotherhood women donning the niqab to a greater degree. One sees Brotherhood beards as increasingly large and expansive, and sometimes being paired with a trimmed mustache. And this blurring is precisely why multiple practices are so important, because it's not enough to just have a distinct beard, because you could have this issue of another group. But if, for example, you had the beard and the observance of Isbel, then you're on pretty strong grounds. Or the beard, the observance of Isbel, and you saw someone praying in shoes, well, then you would know unequivocally. And so here, one of the challenges of Salafism is every act of communication is also an opportunity for miscommunication. And this is a point that Wilson Chacko Jacobs makes in his wonderful book about gender in early 20th century Egypt, and gender and masculinity specifically. And so the Salafis have that problem too, and so they have to find ways of overcoming that, of compensating for that. But I think it's absolutely the case, to come back to your question, that Salafis live alongside non-Salafis, that there's not a parallel Islamic sector in which Islamists exist. There's not a parallel Salafi sector in which Salafis exist. There are certainly spaces that are oriented to those approaches or particular movements. But these folks move through daily life. They go to public schools, they go to universities. They not only shape the societies from which they've emerged, but are shaped by them.
Thank you very much for that. So I have a question from Rashid Goyal, who asks, could you clarify your view with regard to the notion that Salafism is not normatively committed to any specific legal doctrine or legal school? I could read, shall we do another question, or you answer this and then I will.
I'm just seeing the follow-up to Rashid's question. Well, so I'll answer this question in two parts. The first is to refer back to Henri Lazier's work, which is this conceptual history of Salafism as being about a normative reliance on the Quran and Sunna as a source of law, and a commitment to neo-Hanbali theology. And that this is really a concept that continues to define the Salafi movement. I think where one sees the distinction here, and Rashid, I think we've talked about this distinction between Salafis and Wahhabi Hanbalis, is precisely in this question of what one does with the madhab tradition. And it's particularly notable here. I'll come back to Ibn Baz and this question of gender segregation, because where you really see the rubber hit the road on this interpretive question is that Muhammad bin Ibrahim makes the argument for gender segregation. He refers back to the tools used by the madhab tradition, to damning the pretexts of sin, even to maslaha amma, the common good. These aren't tools available to Ibn Baz. And so it would have been much easier for him to use them, but he doesn't have them to use. There are significant costs associated with using them. Now, I think there has been some blurring, in part because, since the 70s, the Wahhabi Hanbali elite have sought to claim the mantle of Salafism by essentially making the argument that because Ibn Hanbal derived all of his positions from the Quran and the Sunnah, and because they follow Ibn Hanbal, therefore they are actually following the Quran and the Sunnah. I don't find that analytically to be I think that's a political move. I don't find it analytically or substantively to be a particularly persuasive claim. It's very interesting as a political move. Now, to get to sort of the second aspect of your question, some would say the wearing of beards by Salafi men as an expression of piety is not per se a component of their Salafism. Part of what's interesting in the late 80s is that there's a shift of sorts, that prior to the late 80s, there are folks who made exactly this claim. And in the late 80s, there's essentially a shift to my mind. And this shift is very much reflected in two very different responses that Ibn Baz and another major Saudi Salafi scholar, Ibn al-Uthaymeen, make about what to do if you're forced to shave your beard. And the questioners here are essentially enrolled in Egyptian state institutions. One of them is enrolled in the School of Maritime Science or something to that effect. He's trying to become a sailor of sorts. And the other, maritime transportation, Bahar Nakli is what it is. And the other is essentially just a conscript to the military. And they asked Ibn Baz and Ibn Uthaymin, respectively, what should we do? We're required to shave the beard. And Ibn Baz says, basically, you got to leave Egypt. Get me a tazkiyah, get me a certification of your religious commitment from the head of Ansar Sunna at this time, Muhammad Ali Abdul Rahim, and we'll get you to a State university. Whereas Ibn al-Uthaymin says, you should have everyone in the army rebel and instruct your superiors that the reason why, that these sins are the reason why Arab armies have lost in battle, implicitly to Israel here. These are two very different approaches, but what's striking is that in both cases, the beard is non-negotiable, that the beard is understood as a form of ibadah, whereas it wasn't understood so before. Now, to dig down a little bit deeper into the question, well, what if someone still claims today that the beard is not a component of their Salafism? I would argue that that's certainly a position someone can take, but the dominant understanding of Salafism would not consider someone without a beard to be a Salafi. And specifically, they wouldn't consider someone with an Ikhwan beard to be a Salafi. They would look different than the people around them. And so my argument isn't that the beard is essential to Salafism because of a particular set of sources. My argument is that the beard has become normative within Salafism because Salafis made it normative within Salafism. And that is striking as a historical development because it's this process of textual and social reconstruction.
I have a question from Fawzia, but before that, I just wanted to point at how interesting the fact is that an Egyptian actually sent the questions to Sheikh bin Baz and Ibn Uthaymin rather than asking, I don't know, the head of Ansar al-Sunnah and Muhammadiyya at the time in Egypt. But let me just read Fawzia's question. Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. You've mentioned that the Egyptian and Syrian movements had differences and similarities. Could you mention them?
Well, the big difference in the Syrian case is they never really get a mass Salafi movement off the ground. That there's the Association for Islamic Civilization, Jam'iyat al-Tamadun al-Islami, which publishes a journal from 1939 to 1981. And so they're incredibly prolific. I mean, this journal is probably 20,000 pages in total. It's an incredibly rich source. But it's not, in contrast to Ansar Sunnah's journal, it's not paralleled by action on the ground. It's not paralleled by the development of a network of mosques, a network of clubs. And that's striking, right? And that in some sense limits their sway to intellectual sway. I will say, and another aspect of this is, it also, I think, has the effect of enabling them to straddle a line that exists, sort of a certain porous line that exists in the 30s and 40s between Salafis and Islamic modernists that becomes increasingly untenable after this point. And this is an argument that Henri Lazier has made. I think it allows them to straddle that line a little bit better. And so really from the 50s on, it's certainly the case that Tamadun al-Islami is hosting major Salafi scholars. Al-Albani writes in there all the time, but they also host a bunch of folks who are either Islamists or traditionalist scholars. It's a much more intellectually diverse forum than Ansar Sunnah's publications. And so, we might also there note political circumstances, that the opportunities for this kind of project were more circumscribed in Syria during the second half of the 20th century, that we don't have any we do, of course, have the identification of an Islamic revival, Sahwa, in Syria, not just in Egypt, not just in Saudi Arabia, but the opportunities for activism in the context of that sahwa are more limited, as Thomas Piret's wonderful book has shown.
I just want to make a quick comment. It so happened that when I was recently in Jordan, it happened that the Marad al-Kitab, the book fair was going on. And I asked someone who had been there, so how was the book fair? And as it is well known, Salafis often do get like this negative comments from non-Salafis. And so this person told me, oh, it was packed with Salafis carrying these heavy books. Now, to be fair, when I actually went and I went 3 days in a row, you cannot miss the presence of Salafis in the book fair. And so perhaps, I mean, I want to throw this as an idea, as a question that we can perhaps think collectively. If we can think of a seriously textual culture being also an important, not exclusively a Salafi marker, but an important marker of Salafism. There were several centers there selling Salafi texts and a serious Salafi presence, buying books and carrying these heavy books, as you are well aware that in the Arab world that they do publish these very heavy hardcover books. So if we can think perhaps that being members of a very seriously textual based community is also an important marker of Salafism, perhaps.
So I think the textuality of Salafism is, in some sense, right, a throwback to these long-standing models of Islamic learning. In other respects, a condition only considerable or imaginable in the context of modernity and the spread of mass literacy and the access to text. I think the best parallel here would be traditionalist scholars who still take these texts quite seriously. I don't want to sound as though I think the Brotherhood and Islamists generally don't take text seriously, but that's not really where their main set of debates are. That they certainly have a textual tradition that they have built up, in some sense, a series of almost commentaries on Hassan al-Banna's Usul al-Ashrin, that you kind of have this model of al-Banna, which is then explicated through a series of commentaries and hyper commentaries or super commentaries on top of them. But they don't have the same focus on these major collections of texts. The question is sort of what does it mean to have this deep textual culture? Where does it live, right? Because one of the sort of best comments I ever got about understanding these massive, beautiful scholarly collections is that there are some people who read them, and there's some people who display them. And instead of saying, oh, you display them, therefore you don't care about learning, sure, that might be the case in some instances, but it's also the case, right, that we have a signaling. If we're thinking in terms of social history, in terms of anthropology here, we have a signaling mechanism, that they are signaling their commitment to a particular textual order. And the challenge of this textual order is precisely that it is historically discontinuous, that is neo-traditionalist, we might say. And here I'm thinking back to Brinkley Messick's classic work about the transformation of the Islamic textual tradition in the context of modernity in 20th century Yemen. Everything from the reorganization of the structure of the page to the reorganization of the contents of the page. And the move away from those beautiful spiral structures of writing. And so the goal here is to say we are committed to continuity. This gets back to citation, right? We are committed to continuity with the past. And again, that's true, but that's not the whole story. We need to take seriously the self-presentation and lugging books around a book fair is, of course, a form of self-presentation, and displaying books at a book fair is a form of self-presentation. The sort of that project of self-presentation and the way in which it reflects a particular understanding of knowledge and authority, which in fascinating ways is actually pretty discontinuous with Islamic history. Because if we think of the basic model of transformation in Islamic history, it is person to person. It is, to come back to William Graham's classic work, it is the Isnad paradigm. This is very different. This is not the Isnad paradigm at all. Now, it's not to say that those folks don't also learn with scholars who uphold that paradigm, but there's something about buying these books for one's personal collection without even the question of whether one is going to get ijazah for these books. That underscores that it's not necessarily a question of constituting a rupture. It can also be the coexistence, often in parallel, of multiple logics of learning. And the utilization of those multiple logics of learning specifically in specific contexts.
Yes, thank you. No, I couldn't agree more. That's why I wanted to kind of, in a way, test, what you thought of that. Let me check if there are any more questions. Did you want to?
Yes, thank you very much, first of all, and I apologize of being late. There was an accident or something. It was impossible to be here on time. I'm really sorry. So
no problem at all.
If Besnik presented me, yes,
yeah.
Okay. So
and I also told them about the train, so
okay.
that has been done.
Okay.
So Professor Vimercati is the chair of Hadith and Prophetic Studies here, and so who initiated basically this project. So yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
In any way, and I was thinking, this question, what distinguishes the Salafi conception, the Salafi understanding of Sunnah from non-Salafi, or let's say traditional conceptions of Sunnah? There are ways to explain this, of course, in a conceptual manner. I think that what you said, the question of continuity and discontinuity is this a dynamic, concept or something static, okay, which a historical sort of state which needs to be reproduced in the same manner as it had been exactly, and not something dynamic which needs to be, relived each new generation in its own way somehow. So there are differences like this to explain. But then regarding the practice, it's true that I experience sometimes it's not so easy to explain to somebody who has not so much experience with Islamic practices, with Sunnah. What is the difference between the Salafi who has a long beard, for example, and the non-Salafi who has a long beard? Okay, why do have both? Why both have a long beard, but one is Salafi and one not? And both say, I'm doing this because I want to follow what the Prophet does. So I would claim that it's in most cases easily recognizable who is the Salafi and who's not. I would claim so. In many, of course, maybe this is something one shouldn't say, but I would claim that it's somehow you can recognize this. And there's a colleague in France who works in ethnography, and he worked on this, on this exterior science. So visibility, as you said, is an important aspect of as well. Piety is something which is conditioned from visibility. I think this is an important thing. But still, it's not so easy to explain. Maybe one element, this is maybe my question, maybe you have different ideas, is also the way that the Sunnah here is somehow, this is something of a feeling, okay? I'm trying to conceptualize. But Sunnah is something which, affirms your identity. your group identity or even your individual identity, and which because you were talking about the statement. It's a statement, you know. So there's this need to affirm yourself through this etiquette of the Sunnah.
Yeah.
And this is, to my mind, it's not the. I mean, it's a different concept of Sunnah, because actually I mean, in classical sources, if you want, okay, you have this formal aspect, of course, okay, I mean, wearing a beard, for example. But why you wear it is different, I think. Maybe that's why is it, you know, it's not to affirm it, it's on the contrary, it's, you know, to surpass your identity somehow. It's something which is beyond you, okay, which you're trying to conform yourself in order to, you know, that it transforms you somehow, okay, but not to affirm and to show and to state who you are and what you are. I don't know if this is clear enough, but this is something I was thinking about when I was listening to your very interesting talk.
Well, so thank you for these questions and ideas. I'll sort of tackle them, I guess, in three parts. So your point about how continuity essentially has to be continually reproduced and relived, I think is right on. And I think that we see this in Salafism as a project, that the reason one needs these practices is precisely because the world around you is not structured along your normative vision. And so essentially what you are doing, and this is why practice is so central to Salafism, is without access to the levers of state power, without access to the ability to really create what approximates a Salafi world, a Salafi social world, a Salafi professional world, you need to create this world with your body, where the body becomes your world. Now, there's this long-standing question about the relationship between internal and external state. I mean, this is a question in the Islamic scholarly tradition. This is a question in the anthropological tradition, most notably with Clifford Geertz and then Talal Asad's critique of Geertz. I would say in broad terms, the real shift we have is that in the pre-modern period, it's certainly the case that what one looks like can matter. Namely, it can matter in terms of defining whether you are a Muslim or non-Muslim. I mean, if we're thinking of the Khiyar code here, it can matter in terms of defining whether you are a man, you know, we're talking of beards, whether you're a man, whether you're a pious Muslim man. So the beard can serve as a marker not just of masculinity, but of a particularly religiously inflected masculinity. But I would say in the pre-modern period, the basic assumption here is that internal states, the external states are a manifestation of internal states. That the external doesn't, in some sense, not stand on its own, but it isn't it isn't sort of equal in importance to the internal. And the argument I make is that the reason why that shifts is actually a broader shift of state-sponsored projects of subject formation in the 20th century that make this linkage between ethics, or here emulating the Prophet, and visible allegiance to a given political project. I want to come back to another aspect of your comment and question, though, which is this question of what it means to cite the Sunnah. Because I think it's a really interesting question. Because essentially, there's a move here that Salafis make that is only possible in the context of literacy and the spread of printing. Namely, they say, we've gone through all of these Hadith reports. We have sources that previous scholars could have never dreamed of. And this is how we can tell, and this is one of the claims Al-Bani makes sometimes. This is how we can tell that these Hadith reports that you thought were sound are not actually sound at all. And in some sense, it brings to mind the move that Muhammad Ali al-Shawkani made in 18th and early 19th century Yemen, where he said, I'm engaging in ijtihad. We're talking about, this broader project of Sunni traditionalism. I'm engaging in ijtihad based on the Quran and Sunnah, and I can do this because I've got the manuscripts. But this is, and Yemen has this rich history of manuscripts. I've got access to them. You don't have access to them, so this is why I can make this claim. I see Besnik smiling. I mean, this is a great move. Salafis in some sense are doing a much more expansive thing because they have a much more expansive set of sources to engage with. And in doing so, they're in some sense taking Sunnah from being a practice that is primarily about mimesis, about imitating those around you, and not primarily about the textual tradition. Though it's of course undergirded by a textual tradition, but on a mass level, it's primarily about mimesis. And here I'm actually drawing on Soloveitchik's argument, to being a practice that one gets primarily from books, that one gets from pamphlets, that one gets from magazines, that what is orthodox is being defined increasingly by mass-mediated printed products. And that, it does two things. One is it changes the ranges of sources that are in the conversation. The other is it actually scrambles the meaning of what Sunnah is. And I have, I remember when I was doing the chapter on praying in shoes, I was having the darndest time figuring out what Salafis were claiming about the religious status of praying in shoes. Because sometimes when they said it was Sunnah, they meant it was mustahab. And other times when they said it was Sunnah, they meant it was required. And I would be going through these pamphlets and saying, which definition are they using here? What the heck is going on here? This is a term, this is a usage of the term that is really kind of a floating signifier here. But then I realized that was kind of the point, that they weren't, that the boundaries were moving here, and that they weren't actually clear on which category they fell into. There was dispute, and so essentially the way of papering over these final two categories of sort of the five-part categorization of this monoclaw was by just saying it was Sunnah and leaving ambiguous what it meant for it to be Sunnah. Because sometimes it was just simply about being praiseworthy, but one is not, one is not obligated to do, and one is not punished for not doing it, one is simply rewarded. And sometimes it was actually that they considered these actions to be required, such as the beard.
As we're approaching almost to the end of this, I was wondering if I could throw back again to your earlier work on the beard, but on the focus of, if I remember the quote correctly, as an attempt to define what Sunni Islam is.
Yes.
Because
Okay.
I find that a fascinating. So it's like, I think it would be great if you can speak to that.
So in 1988, this leading preacher with an Ansar Sunnah Muhammadiyah, Ahmed Taha Nasser, describes the beard as a noble announcement to introduce society to what it means to be Sunni. A noble announcement to introduce society to what it means to be Sunni. That's clearly, I have a particular soft spot for this claim also. And so the question is first, what's going on? Here we have a claim that to be Sunni is to be Salafi. And this is something we see in other sources, that there's an attempt to claim that the only true Sunnism, and thus the only true Islam, is Salafism. But what's so striking is this claim that it's a noble announcement, a nuenan beriza, to society. Now, we might note that society is a distinctly modern concept. We also might note that this concept of an announcement is a very interesting one because it's a profoundly visible one. This isn't about one's internal state, primarily anyway. It's, if anything, the internal state is secondary. It is about making a public statement. And my argument is essentially that the only way we understand that kind of public statement is by tracing back to this history of this linkage between ethics and visibility that Salafism, like all other social movements in 20th century Egypt, very much imbibed first from the Ottoman Egyptian state and then from the British colonial state.
Aron, I could not be more grateful that you joined us. Your book has given rise to a lot of conversations. I've been talking to friends all these days who have read, some of them have read chapters, some of them have read the entire book. We are really grateful that you that you did this conversation with us. Looking forward to having you next time in person. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Next Tuesday, next week, as I said, we will continue. Frank Griffel will talk about Ash'arism and the Abyssinian tradition. Please join us in the upcoming weeks. Thank you to all of you for coming, and especially thank you to Aron Roxinger for this amazing presentation.
Thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And good night to all of you who are, or actually, no, it's early for you. So thanks again. All right. So I'll end the session here. And I know that you already have a meeting waiting for you.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for having me, Besnik. This was a lot of fun. I really, really enjoyed it.
Our pleasure.
All right. Have a good day.
Have a good day.